This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. This Week in Virology, Episode 8, November 14th, 2008. I'm Vincent Racaniello.
I'm Dick Despommier.
And Dick, we have reached number 8. Will we reach 100?
Wow. I think it's an ambitious program, but let's go for it.
You know, that's our goal, 100 episodes and more, but I enjoy it a great deal. Doing it and preparing for it, and I enjoy when people enjoy it. Yeah. Even one feedback that we get is very pleasing. For example...
Yeah, go on.
We got feedback from AJ. Alan, I don't want to mention last names. I don't know if people
it's Alan.
Alan sent an email saying he loved the video game one, and so did Frank. And Christos said he loved it and sent us a link to a game on the iPhone about viruses. So I went to look it up. It's called Virus. It's $2.99 at the App Store on iTunes. So I don't know if you know this, Dick, but you can download apps for your iPhone. You don't have an iPhone, right? Neither do I.
No, but I have an iPod, and I download music all the time, right. So I guess I have access to all these other things.
Well, if you have an iPod Touch, you can put these games on it. Otherwise, you have a conventional iPod. You're conventional. Huh?
I'm a music guy.
You can go to the iTunes App Store and download this. It's by Manta Research. It's called Virus. And it is described, your body is under attack from viruses. Use the touch interface to grow white blood cells and rotate the device to trap the viruses and destroy them. Once you've defeated all stages of an infection, a new infection zone will appear and the battle will begin anew.
Oh, my God.
So if anyone has used this game, let us know what you think. You could send an email, TWiV@TWiV.tv. You could even record a review, and we'll play it on the podcast. We'll make you famous. Because I don't have an iPhone.
Why am I laughing, Vince? Why am I laughing?
Because you're already famous.
No, that's not why I'm laughing.
You are famous, though. I'm not. You are famous. Everyone. When I came in the office today to meet Dick, there were reporters talking to him, and they couldn't get words in because there were so many of them. I don't have an iPhone, so I can't try it. But if anyone has one, let us know what you think. I think it's great that they make games based on microbial infections.
I totally agree.
And as we said last time, it helps you learn, right?
It certainly does. It sounds like this game needs more weapons from the host side of things, though. If it's
I was thinking
cell,
the same thing.
I need some neutralizing antibody in there, otherwise we're doomed.
In fact, this is a good point. Today in my virology class, we are doing a paper which is about norovirus, which is a virus that causes gastroenteritis.
Just had a recent outbreak, by the way.
And the point of that is antibody is very important for combating infection, not lymphocytes, as in this game. So this is a bit of a simplistic approach, but I'm sure it's a fun game.
It can be refined, too.
We don't have to be too critical, right, Dick?
Nope.
Okay, so that's the iPhone app called Virus by Manta Research. Free ads, right?
Hey, you bet.
First story up. Polio drive misses 120,000 children in Afghanistan.
Whoops.
The gist of this is because of armed conflict, they can't immunize everyone. And we talked about this a few episodes ago. Polio is still endemic, right, in Afghanistan. We could get rid of it if we could reach everyone. So this is an article where tens of thousands of children, mostly in rural parts of southern provinces, miss out on immunization due to insecurity and threats to health workers. 120,000 kids. That's a problem. If you can't immunize everyone, you're going to have an issue. So apparently, according to this article, the Taliban had said they wouldn't disrupt the immunization campaign. They would let the workers pass through. But gunmen attacked and pillaged an immunization campaign convoy in October. Healthcare providers were threatened, and of course this disrupted the immunization.
That's right.
No Taliban spokesperson was available for comment. So I don't know what's going on. Obviously there's a loss of communication, right? The leadership says we'll leave you alone, but the guys shoot. But it's just the kids who lose out.
You bet.
There's a vaccine. They should be getting it, and they can't. And this is where you have you could have the most perfect vaccine, right? If you can't get it to people, it's useless.
So in warfare, two things suffer. The first thing to go is truth. The second thing to go is health. We know this.
Dick, isn't truth always gone?
Well, it goes faster when there's a war than when there's not.
I suppose. I find it's very sad because the kids deserve to have a good life. I mean, we know they're not going to have the greatest life, but at least they could be healthy.
Yep.
And everyone should benefit from all the health advances. So this is just a
symptom
certainly
of a big disease. It's a symptom.
And this is an example of what we talked about in Afghanistan, why we can't get rid of polio there. And Pakistan is similar because there is also armed conflict in Pakistan. So on that sad note, we move to a more upbeat note. And you must have seen these stories this week. A person in Germany who had leukemia and HIV, AIDS.
I heard about this, yes.
Got a bone marrow transplant and is apparently now virus-free. Now, so this we need to back up a little and talk about. We haven't discussed AIDS and HIV in this series, and I guess it's bad because it is without doubt the most prevalent virus infection on the planet.
In humans.
What else are there? Yes, of course, in humans. If you weren't talking about humans, though, what would be even more prevalent? Mosquitoes?
Well?
Mice?
You mean for the next big viral infection?
No, what species harbors more viruses than humans infected with HIV? It's an interesting question.
Oh.
You don't know the answer? I don't either. We'll research it. This case is very interesting. So HIV causes the disease known as AIDS, right? Acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Over 30 million people currently infected globally, most in Africa. Very bad disease. Virus infects you for years. We will have to talk about this on a coming episode in some detail. Perhaps my colleague in Switzerland, Jeremy Luban, or we have Scott Hammer here at Columbia can participate and really talk about this disease. There are so many aspects of it.
You know, Vince, what's amazing to me is that we know almost everything there is to know about the biology of this viral infection, and yet it stymies us in terms of vaccine approaches, prevention approaches. I mean, why are there so many people infected with it still? Why haven't we been able to wipe it out? I think that's a big question, isn't it?
It's a huge question. Many levels. I mean, we don't have a vaccine yet. People are working on it.
Big disappointment for the last
We have antiviral drugs.
We do.
And they're very effective. You can live many years, but the problem is in Africa, it's hard to get them there. Same problem with the polio vaccine in Afghanistan.
Plus,
you can't get it, they're expensive.
Regions of the world that don't believe that it's a sexually transmitted disease.
Yes. So all these things we need to cover. But for today's story, so this young man had leukemia for which he was given a bone marrow transplant. So in leukemia, you have cancerous white blood cells. You have to get rid of them. The white blood cells come from the bone marrow.
So you do a whole body radiation to wipe out.
So you wipe out all your old ones with X-rays, and then you inject donor stem cells from someone who matches you immunologically so you don't reject them. This is a risky procedure. 20 to 30% of the people die. Now, in this case, they decided to give this young man bone marrow from someone who had a mutation in a gene encoding a protein called CCR5. CCR5 is the co-receptor for HIV. It's one of the co-receptors. And it has been shown previously in a number of studies, there are people who naturally have mutations in this gene, and they are resistant to infection with HIV because the virus can't get into cells. So the people who designed this gentleman's bone marrow transplant decided to match him with someone that had a deletion in this CCR5 gene. So the consequence is now he is free of virus, as far as we can tell. Now, this has not been submitted for publication, so the results haven't been studied by our rigorous peer review system. But this would be amazing,
So,
right?
Vince, does this sound like a cure?
Well, it's not a cure because we can't give everyone bone marrow transplants, correct?
I would think so, but
maybe there are other ways.
If you're desperate and you're dying from AIDS and the triple therapy hasn't worked anymore, what's the recourse?
Well, this is very expensive.
Oh, I'm sure.
So it's not a cure for 33 million people.
No, I hear what you're saying.
But maybe you could in some way disrupt this gene in some point in the future. I mean, right now we could probably design inhibitors. I know there are approaches where you give people antibodies to this protein, CCR5, and that blocks infection quite effectively.
Right.
But you still have the gene. So, yes, this tells us that some kind of approach blocking this gene product would be very effective.
Yep.
But not bone marrow transplant. This is far too risky and expensive. There is one caveat, though, here, Dick. Mm-hmm. Now, HIV uses two co-receptors to get into cells. There are strains that use one or the other, and there are strains that use both. So, for example, the viruses that seem to be transmitted from person to person, the HIV viruses, seem to be the ones that prefer using CCR5, the one deleted in this case. Once you're infected, after a few years, your body produces mainly viruses that use the other co-receptor, which is CXCR4. These are both chemokine receptors that bind proteins in the cell that are involved in immune responses. So the caveat here is that this gentleman could be infected by a virus that uses this other co-receptor. Those don't appear to be transmitted all that often, but you could imagine that, let's say this person got infected with a CCR4 using virus. It might evolve to populate him, or let's say he's infected with a CCR5 using virus. Maybe it would mutate in him to use CXCR4.
Is that an easy mutation?
We don't know. I don't believe it's been reported, but you can imagine it would happen, right?
Of course, given enough events.
As you like to say, we're all mutants anyway.
Exactly.
So anyway, this is very exciting, but it's not a cure for sure, because bone marrow transplantation is not something you want to do on massive numbers of people, but it does point to these co-receptors as important molecules for intervention. So we'll see what happens here. I think this is very interesting. And of course, all the press has picked it up.
Naturally. Any positive news about AIDS is certainly welcome.
Of course. And we'll come back to AIDS in the future. We do pick up things in a timely basis on this podcast.
Do we?
So yesterday, the New York Times published a short article. Maybe it was Wednesday. When is the Science Times? Wednesday, Tuesday? On the rising incidence of West Nile in California because of these mortgage foreclosures.
Right.
And that's something we reported on weeks ago.
We preempted that story.
So I think we're on to things here. We pick up stuff. But, Dick, we do this for a living, right? I don't mean to sound arrogant, but we think about this all the time. So that's why we're doing this podcast, to share this with people. And in fact, I don't find many other podcasts dedicated to viruses. There are podcasts on bacteria and fungi and mixed things. There are many science podcasts, but I think we may be the only one on viruses.
Well, let's not abuse the privilege.
And I didn't find any on just parasites, Dick.
Well, we'll have to correct that sometime also, I think. Malaria is not a trivial problem, as you know, so maybe we could throw some of that in there.
Well, I don't think people would mind if we even talked about it on this.
Certainly not.
So it's always instructional.
In fact, raising the issue of HIV, AIDS, you never die from HIV, AIDS, you die with HIV, AIDS. You die from something else that HIV, AIDS allows to happen. And in many instances, those are multicellular or single-celled organisms like malaria, leishmaniasis, strongyloides, these other weird things that wouldn't be a problem if your immune system worked properly. But AIDS interferes with that, and then all of a sudden it becomes a major problem.
Yeah, so it destroys, of course, our lymphocytes and makes it impossible for us to combat other infections. So you're right, you get opportunistic infections.
Exactly. Toxoplasmosis is one of the big ones.
Right.
A lot of AIDS patients used to die from that before we realized what was going on, because toxoplasma is held in check by interleukin-12, and AIDS downregulates interleukin-12, allowing a latent infection of toxoplasma to blossom, and then you die from an encephalitis. So for many, many years in France, they didn't know what was going on. I didn't say many years, maybe 2 years, until they figured it out. And then, of course, the Bactrim therapy would be given along with the anti-HIV therapy. And, we don't get that death anymore.
Next story, New York Times again. The Times is actually a good source of science. I mean, they are a comprehensive paper, and they have a science section every week, Science Times.
Religiously.
I think it's good to get people reading about science, don't you?
Absolutely.
We have the art section and the home section. That's great, but science, getting people educated is good. So, we're in the education business here, so I appreciate that the New York Times does a Science Time. I don't mean to ignore other papers at the expense of the Time, but in fact, many of these other stories come from other papers. Right. Anyway, the New York Times, November 12th, 2 days ago. Google uses searches to track flu spread. Did you hear about this?
Of course I did.
Do you want to tell us what your take is on this?
Well, Google does a sort of a database based on the number of hits per subject matter, and you'd think that there would be a correlation between. They make an assumption that there might be a correlation between an outbreak of influenza and public interest in influenza, so that when there ever is a case, you'll notice that there's an increase in the number of hits on the websites dealing with influenza. So is that out of curiosity, or is it because there are more people infected with influenza? And that's the big thing to determine. And also knowing where the outbreaks occurred. Like, for instance, there was just a big cluster of H5N1 influenza outbreak in Indonesia. This occurred just a couple of days ago. I imagine that the number of hits on the Internet from Indonesia for the term influenza will go way up, because Internet usage is pretty common throughout most of the world. So maybe Google is right in that sense, that you could track influenza outbreaks and where they're occurring by knowing where the people are coming from on their websites to look for it on the Internet. But also, you and I look on the Internet for influenza every now and then, too. So there's a lot of mud in the background that you have to get rid of in order to make sure that what you're looking at is due to the outbreak and not due to curiosity.
The article says it's a fruitful marriage of mob behavior and medicine. And so in a few cases, they've tried to correlate these increases in searches with actual data on influenza, and they correlate fairly well. But as one emergency room physician writes, we don't have any evidence that this is more timely than our emergency room data.
Right.
And, of course, you could game this system very easily.
That's right.
You could imagine at a college, some Midwestern college with 10,000 freshmen, hey, let's search for Ebola.
Yeah, right.
And and then you get this. But, of course, I mean, at some point, Google would like to use this as a indicator. But
of course they would.
You have to validate it first.
I know.
Personally, I find this interesting, but just anecdotal.
I would agree.
What would be better, Dick?
Well, it would be better if you would have regional reporting centers that could then funnel information into ProMed, P-R-O-M-E-D.
Right.
And then to hook that ProMed reporting system up with Google and hook it to Maps, so that you could go to Google Maps and find out where these diseases were actually occurring based on ProMed reports, which are more reliable, but still they have some issues. But not as many as this system would have, I think. So that's what I'd opt for.
I mean, I think Google is doing this already. Do you know Larry Brilliant?
Well, I know the name.
So he is executive director of Google.org, which is their nonprofit wing.
Right.
And he is, I think a few weeks ago in the New York Times Magazine, he was interviewed about using real-time reporting of outbreaks and trying to establish maps. Dick, we have to get involved in this in some way.
Tell me about it. Maybe this is an open mic message to Larry Brilliant to support This Week in Virology, and we'll help organize the rest.
Larry, I know you're probably not listening, but I should say Dr. Brilliant because I don't know you.
You don't
but
know.
We would love to be involved. Dick and I have many years of experience and some knowledge.
And access to lots of graduate students that would love to be involved.
So we'd love to be involved, all altruistic, of course.
Absolutely.
Very interesting, though. It's kind of scary that Google saves all the search terms.
Well, that's how they build up their databases, and that's how they supply their advertising.
Dick, do you search for Despommier on a regular basis?
Yeah, I do, actually.
Are there lots of Despommiers?
Not too many. I know them all, actually. They're all relatives of mine. There's nobody that's not a relative that's got that name.
Well, you better be
Racaniello?
careful. Yes, there are less than 100 in the U.S., probably all derived from the same stock in Italy.
Does it have a meaning? Does your name actually mean something in Italian?
Yeah, my father, who was from Italy, never said it had a meaning, no.
All right. Ours means apple trees.
Yes. That's a good name. I like apples. If you keep searching Despommier, the CDC is going to think there's going to be an outbreak of Despommier disease. You better watch out.
There are some that already think there is.
All right, next story. Measles outbreak in Gibraltar.
Oh.
You know where Gibraltar is?
I do.
You ever been?
Nope. I have been to the southern tip of Spain, however.
So it's owned by Britain, correct?
Yes.
But it's part of Spain, physically.
That's right.
So August to October. 1% of the population, which is only 28,000 people, but amounts to almost 300 cases, mostly in school children. So what do you think happened here, Dick?
It's either a failed vaccine or lack of vaccine, I would think.
Yeah, so I think that they underestimated the vaccine coverage. There's a very good vaccine against measles virus, which is an RNA-containing virus, enveloped, respiratory transmission.
Live virus vaccine.
Live virus vaccine. It's administered with two other vaccines, mumps and rubella. So measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, you get childhood live vaccine, 3 components, MMR, and it prevents all 3 childhood diseases. Measles is a very contagious infection. It spreads very readily.
What's the long-term danger of measles infection?
Subacute sclerosing panencephalitis.
Exactly.
SSPE.
Exactly.
A neurological degenerative disease which can happen many, many years after measles infection. All we know is that it starts with a measles infection in a child, the infection's cleared, and then many years later you have this development of neurological deficit.
That's right.
We don't know why.
Yeah.
Very interesting
Slow
disease.
virus.
A slow virus, yes. Now in Gibraltar, so they didn't immunize a lot of the kids, which is too bad, right? Measles in children, not so much of a problem that you recover, but you can have these late sequelae. And did you know, Dick, that in countries where kids are undernourished, measles is very severe?
I do know that, actually.
So in Africa, it's very atypical. You get huge rashes, big lesions in the mouth, can often be fatal.
Yep.
Very interesting how a good immune system requires nutrition and rest and lack of stress.
So,
all the things we have in our modern society, right?
What would be an infection in us would be a disease in some
Exactly. Virology is not so simple.
That's right.
Now, the thing that I find interesting about this outbreak, population of Gibraltar is 28,000. Now, historically, we are taught that a measles outbreak requires a population of minimum 300,000 people. Mm-hmm. And that's a number that it's been calculated based on known epidemics, outbreaks, transmission properties of the virus, how much is shed, and its stability, and so forth. You need that many people in order to sustain an epidemic. So this isn't an epidemic, it's an outbreak. So I suppose in this case the numbers are lower. But it's a small population in which sustained this outbreak. So I'm curious about that. I don't know the answer to that.
How about a transfer student?
Perhaps someone introduced it, right? Here it's suggested that the virus came from an outbreak in Algeciras. Do you know where Algeciras is in relation to Gibraltar?
You'll tell us.
It's across the Bay of Algeciras. It's across the water, and there's a road connecting the two cities, of course.
Interesting.
So it could have happened over the summer where people travel and bring the virus over. But the size of the population is quite interesting to me.
By the way, measles virus is only in humans, or can we have a reservoir of it?
This is a great question, Dick. This is why you need to be part of This Week in Virology.
Because Gibraltar is also noted for its monkeys.
Is it?
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that. So you're the ecologist. This is fabulous. Measles is as far as we know, exclusively human infection.
Right.
And did you know that the WHO wants to eradicate it after polio is eradicated?
Well, if it's only in humans, then there's the possibility of that at least, isn't there?
There is a possibility, and there's one serotype. There are many, many more measles infections right now than polio infections in the world. Millions.
And what is the difference, then, between the measles vaccine and the polio vaccine? Why is it so much easier to give the polio vaccine than it is to give the measles vaccine?
Now, the measles vaccine has to be injected. So you need a health system that is trained to do this. You can't just have volunteers giving liquid to drink, as is the case with the polio vaccine. You have to have someone who can give a shot. Can you give a shot, Dick? You probably could, but you're not allowed to.
I have no insurance. Believe me, please don't.
Not supposed to. You have to have trained health personnel.
But what about something else? Isn't the virus fragile? And don't you have to keep it refrigerated before you use it?
In both cases, polio and measles vaccines, yes, need to be kept refrigerated. Okay. They're both fragile. Polio is more stable than measles because it can pass through the gut, right? But you have to keep the polio vaccine frozen. And that's one of the problems in delivery in remote areas.
So it's called a cold chain.
You have to maintain the cold chain, which means simply keep the virus frozen.
Precise.
This is interesting. You know what WHO did to maintain a cold chain for distribution of polio vaccine? They developed kerosene-fired freezers.
Really?
Which can be carried on the backs of mobile animals.
Interesting. And
brought into remote regions and keep the vaccine frozen. This is one of the things that is brilliant about WHO. The measles vaccine also has to be kept cold as well, so it's more difficult. I don't know if they can eliminate measles. There are lots of inapparent infections as well as with polio, so that makes it difficult. But I think they have their hands full with polio, so it'll be a while before they get to measles.
So why not just a combination of polio and measles vaccine? Every time you give a polio vaccine, you give the measles vaccine too.
I think it's reasonable. In fact, in the U.S., this was being considered a number of years ago to combine the MMR with polio.
You want an update on the West Nile virus
I do, Dick.
in the USA?
What's our update, Dick?
I think we had a total number so far of 1,200 verified cases. Very, very, very low mortality rate, less than 2%. That's a remarkable improvement over the first couple of years of this infection in the United States. And it's not because the virus has been getting less and less virulent. I think it's because the U.S. physician has become more and more aware of the defining syndrome that you need to know about before you start intervening. So if you have muscle pain, headache, confusion, and fever, you put all those four things together, it apparently is only West Nile virus in this country, until proven otherwise. And so they immediately begin with steroids to keep the swelling of the brain down.
Yes.
And that saves lives.
Yeah, that's the main cause of death, right? Swelling of the brain.
Exactly right. So if you can start an older person on steroid therapy, and then, of course, it turns out to be something else later on, you're going to find that out in about 2 days. Otherwise, they live.
How much time of steroid therapy would be required?
I don't know the exact answer, but I'm sure it's more than a week.
But not a year?
No.
So there would be fewer side effects because the steroids have their own problems,
yes.
right?
No, you don't give them long enough to create a steroid effect.
Okay.
So there's no puffy face syndrome and things like that.
In many encephalitides, you give steroids to keep the swelling of the brain down. That's right.
Exactly. But in young children, surprisingly enough, you don't need to do that. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me why then?
I think their crania are more flexible, right?
Absolutely correct.
What age does it become fixed?
Well, somewhere in the 5 to 7 year old range. After that, the sawtooth joints in the brain in the brain case start to link up together, and they don't move after that. But it does continue to grow, of course, as your brain does grow.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, since we're on the topic of West Nile, I found this article, and I want you to explain it to me.
I'll do my best.
Title is Small Mosquitoes Are Likely Virus Carriers. And this is just up your alley. U.S. entomologists say they've determined that smaller mosquitoes are more likely to be infected with viruses causing human diseases than are larger mosquitoes. It took place in Florida, this study, and they screened different sized mosquitoes for various viruses. So what is this? I don't understand.
I'm sure I don't either. I'm going to ask a question now. Is this a larger version or a smaller version of the same species, or is it smaller species versus larger species?
Okay, here's what they did. They fed mosquitoes blood contaminated with dengue virus and then tested them for infection, taking into account the size of each mosquito by measuring the length of their wings.
I see.
I assume they used the same species.
It had to be for that one because that's Aedes aegypti.
Aedes aegypti only.
Or Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito.
So it could have been either one, right?
Yes. So there are variants among the same species in terms of size.
Right.
The smaller female is more likely to transmit the virus than a larger female then? That's what this data shows?
So what does that mean? Nothing? Irrelevant? Should we throw it away?
I don't know what to make out of it yet. I would have to see more on this one.
Okay.
Because I think it relates very much to the feeding habits of these mosquitoes to people and to birds.
It's an artificial experiment because they feed them contaminated blood. How would you do that in the lab?
Not so difficult, actually. You use a rubber membrane over a glass tube filled with blood, and they will actually penetrate the rubber membrane.
Fabulous.
It's an easy deal, actually.
Okay.
So they use that a lot in malaria experiments also for feeding.
So maybe the small mosquitoes have a sharper proboscis and can get through the rubber membrane.
It's possible.
I mean, these are the kinds of things you need to control for, right?
If that's the case, then this is a laboratory exercise.
Artifacts, sure.
It has nothing to do with the real world.
Okay. One more story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe two. A quick one and a longer one.
All right.
I can't help but... there are three things I want to say, Dick. Actually, I forgot to mention this earlier. In the story on this young man who got a bone marrow transplant and is resistant to AIDS. Yeah. And all the stories I've read and heard on the radio, the reporters are always talking about genetic mutations.
Yeah. Is there another kind?
Dick, this bothers me so much.
What other kind of mutation?
Mutation by a mutation by definition is a change in nucleic acid.
Absolutely.
It is not necessary to say a genetic mutation because there's no other kind. Okay, I got that off my chest.
Yeah, right.
Another thing, there are always articles about sports figures who are forced out of various tournaments or whatever by viruses.
Yeah.
Hey, look at this headline. Virus forces Ivanovic withdrawal. She's a tennis player. Okay. I don't know tennis, but she's a 20-year-old. She's been plagued by a virus and had to withdraw. How do they know she has a virus? She's even saying, I got this virus infection.
A stomach virus.
I was in pain.
That's the other thing that kills me, is
stomach virus or stomach flu. That's another one. There's no stomach flu.
No, there isn't.
She had pain getting out of bed. We don't know where it was. But the point is that if you have pain, it doesn't mean it's a virus. It could be a bacteria. So, Dick, if you got a sore throat, would you immediately conclude it was a virus infection?
I wouldn't conclude anything just based on whether it's sore or not. I could have been.
What else could cause a sore throat?
Well, you could be screaming at a ball game the next day you wake up and you can't talk.
What else?
It could be a bacterial infection.
Absolutely. Very painful bacterial infections.
Could even
of the throat.
have been something you ate.
Right. So the press is very quick to blame things on viruses. And I don't mean to defend viruses.
No, people are, too. I mean, probably she said, I have a virus, I can't play.
No way of knowing unless she has a PCR machine at home. And I'm sure she doesn't. People think when bad things happen to them, it's a virus. Sometimes it's true, but not always.
That's all right.
We need to be a little more discriminating when we read these stories. Not us, but our listeners. Don't believe everything you read.
I'm sure they don't.
Last story is really...
Don't even believe everything you hear.
We try not to mislead, right?
We try not to.
I mean, the whole point of us doing this is to help people understand what's going on in the world of viruses. But if we make a mistake, we'll correct it next time. Last story. Have you heard about making batteries using viruses?
Well, I haven't, Vince. Tell us all about it.
This is just, as you know, viruses are assemblies of repeating subunits.
Right.
So if you take a viral shell, a capsid, it's usually made of repeating numbers of one or a few viral proteins. So if you can figure out a way to attach things to the capsid, you could make arrays of molecules, basically. So this is a paper in Science from a group at MIT. Materials science, biological engineering, perfect melding of talents here. And they used a virus called M13, which is a virus of bacteria. It occurs in long filamentous repeating forms.
Oh, yes.
They engineered the virus so that it would bind cobalt, for example. They put a sequence in the viral coat that is known to bind cobalt, and then these viruses assemble. They add the metals to them, and they basically get electrodes, very tiny electrodes.
Viral electrodes.
Exactly.
I'll be darned.
This is brilliant. This is brilliant.
Wow.
And they have shown that they can make anodes out of these viruses, and then they supply a cathode, a normal cathode, and show that you can get an electrical flow across it.
Wow.
Assembly. They've basically used this is the way a lithium ion is made. You have anodes and cathodes and the flow of electrons between them. And here they've used the viruses to grow cobalt and gold cobalt nanowires, they call them.
Gee, look.
This is an example of a growing field of using viruses to assemble little whatever you got, a nanowire, in this case, nanomachines, because they repeat. The way they assemble is a repeating thing, and it's brilliant, I think.
The one I'm most familiar with like that is tobacco mosaic virus.
Mm-hmm. It's the same kind of structure. It's an elongated, it's a rod-shaped virus, so you could use that as well for this, absolutely. Sure. And the idea here is these are very small batteries. So if you have applications that require very small batteries, here you go. Now,
if you wanted a nano hybrid car, for instance.
A lot of viruses in that car, but you could do it. So I think this is great. We'll put links to all these, of course, including this in the show notes. But this is beautiful stuff. The title of the paper is Virus-Enabled Synthesis and Assembly of Nanowires for Lithium-Ion Battery Electrodes. So that's an example of a virus doing good, right?
Absolutely.
And that's what we like.
We're going to turn their swords into our plowshares.
Science Podcast Pick of the Week. It's not easy to find. I've been looking quite hard. There are many science podcasts. They're good. I've been looking for microbe ones. And we mentioned one last week, harder to find. This week, I want to set forth the New York Times Science Podcast because they've been doing good things with science. They have a weekly podcast. It's just a few minutes long. It's very slick. The voices are very good compared to ours, which are raspy and clipping.
Well, ours are more authentic.
Yeah, we're real virology. We're scientists, and but they do have good stuff. It's not just microbes; it's all kinds of science, and it's very thoughtful. And I mention it also because this week's the Times Science had a whole issue on genes.
Yes, they did.
DNA,
Yes,
RNA, microRNA.
Yes, they
and in
did.
fact, it's very interesting because the whole concept of a gene now is a bit dated because now there are other elements that are expressed that control development in every process in organisms.
The
It's
proteins
fabulous.
control the expression of the genes control the expression of the proteins.
It's
Who's
fabulous.
running who?
Here's how I view it, Dick. The proteins make up the structure. What regulates that are all these other nucleic acids. It's very interesting. So, in fact, in viruses, these small RNAs, microRNAs, are important for very many levels of regulation, which we'll get to in another episode.
Nothing.
We thought it was junk.
It was all called junk DNA.
Junk DNA. Now we know that it's all there for a reason. But Dick, in evolution, would a genome carry crap for so many years? Probably not, right?
No way.
It's there for a
Just
reason.
find another use for it.
We just don't know what it is.
Absolutely right.
It's like Harry Ginsberg used to say. Do you know who Harry Ginsberg was?
He was my chairman too. Of course,
So he was.
eminent.
He hired me. He was the chair of micro.
He was an adenovirologist.
Adenovirologist, and he hired me. And he used to say, there are no non-essential genes in viruses. We just don't know what they do yet.
No, he was absolutely right. He was prophetic.
It's true.
Whereas the rest of us are pathetic.
We're pathetic, maybe.
Yeah, because we didn't pick up on that right away. It took us a long time to come to grips with it.
Well, that's okay. We understand it now, and we're appreciating it.
Yep.
So that's this week's This Week in Virology. This is the podcast where we talk about all things viruses.
We do.
Right? We do. We will put all these links in the show notes. Please send us your favorite science podcasts. Tell us what you like. We'll talk about it.
Absolutely.
Tell us what you want us to talk about. TWiV at twiv.tv. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. Please go to iTunes and subscribe. I put the RSS feed on our website, www.twiv.tv. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time.
See ya.
Good night, Dick.
Good night, Vince.